a great many people declare that the modern world feels meaningless. Numerous thinkers have analysed this in various ways, from pointing to the decline in religion, to economic factors, to those darn phones. But the philosopher Byung-Chul Han views things from a slightly different angle. In his book, The Crisis of Narration, he attributes much of modern meaninglessness to the decline and perversion of narrative. That is, the stories we tell ourselves and other people about life and the world. Han thinks that the way we interpret reality has become increasingly self-destructive, empty, or manipulated. And he wants to know how we can rescue meaning from the jaws of modernity. But the idea that nihilism may be the result of a problem with narratives is a little bit abstract. So let's explore exactly why Han thinks these narratives are so much more important than most of us realize. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. But first, if you want to make some meaningful sense out of the world around you, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans this QR code 40% off their Vantage Plan subscription. It's a fantastic deal, and please do check it out. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on recent reports that President Trump's approval ratings have dropped. While left-wing sources were heavily critical, with one even calling this a disaster for the president, right-wing sources pointed out that the Democratic Party's approval rating is lower and has not recovered much at all since the new administration took over. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing GOP efforts to place limits on the power of judges to stop executive orders, or right-wing sources missing the potential departure of Elon Musk from the Department of Government Efficiency. I just don't have that much time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias. So receiving Ground News' roundup at the end of each day means I can get a variety of news opinions, learn which sources to trust, and make the world less of a bewildering mess. I genuinely do read this every single day, and I find it highly illuminating. Ground News are giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan, so please do check it out. They've become my go-to source for the news, and I'm sure they will be for you as well. But anyway, back to the video. 1. Narrative as meaning. Almost anyone from almost anywhere will have a narrative or a story that they find gripping. This is something we just take for granted, but it is incredibly strange. A great narrative structure grabs someone's attention, seizes control of their emotions right to the base layer, and imbues their present experience with a sense of deep emotional meaning. At least as far back as Plato, philosophers have noticed the extreme impact of narrative on the human mind. Plato even thought that it was so effective and so potentially dangerous that in his ideal state, stories would be tightly controlled so that they could not wreak absolute havoc on the populace. This view of narrative as profoundly powerful has found increasing empirical support from the world of narrative psychology, where thinkers like Jerome Bruner posit that we understand ourselves and our experiences primarily through narrative structures. When we organize our memories, we do not do so like a hard drive, coldly sorting them into a neat system, but like storytellers crafting our story. Bruner thinks this is incredibly important and suggests that narrative manages to tap into both factual information but also emotional resonance. It does not just promote bare understanding, but feeling and therefore action. We can see this pretty clearly in our own lives. If you just read some statistics about the water crisis, then you are quite unlikely to donate some money. But if I instead told you the story of a child growing up, loving their family and friends, before slowly and tragically succumbing to water insecurity and meeting an early death, then this does not just teach you the facts about water shortages, it makes them salient to you. For whatever reason, narrative is one of the key ways that we humans make our lives seem meaningful and imbue sense to the world around us. But Byung-Chul Han thinks we are slowly losing our ability to create narratives in this way, and that this threatens our capacity to understand the world and our own lives. I want to distinguish narratives in a few different ways that are not explicit in Han's work, but seem to me to be at least implied. First, there are the stories that we tell ourselves about us and our lives, and then there are the stories we tell about the world at large. I will call the first a personal narrative and the second a world narrative. Obviously, these two are highly interconnected, but they approach the problem of meaning in subtly different ways. Han also thinks that personal narratives are not crafted in isolation, but through dialogue with our societies and our cultures. I think they're distinguished by subject as opposed to process. To illustrate this, let's use two classic examples from existential philosophy: Friedrich Nietzsche and Fyodor Dostoevsky. Throughout Nietzsche's works, there is a great emphasis on making your life a work of art that clearly intersects with forming a personal narrative. One of his very first books, The Birth of Tragedy, was specifically about the role of stories in helping us bear the sufferings of the world, and his project of creating values is highly swept up in ideas of pushing past tragedy to get to comedy. In other words, ideas of narrative structure. His figure of passive nihilism, the last man, has nothing to make his suffering meaningful, and so all he does is pursue short-term pleasures. So much of Nietzsche's work, from the free spirit works to Ecce Homo, is Nietzsche telling his own philosophical journey as part personal philosophy and part therapeutic exercise. Even his idea of organizing one's will draws from narrative concepts, like having the will all pointing in a single direction and a sense of progressing towards something. Seizing control over your life and supreme authority over yourself is partly a matter of personal narrative. This is how Nietzsche creates meaning, emphasizing a very particular kind of personal heroism. By contrast, Dostoevsky is far more focused on our narrative for the world. As a Christian, he viewed the very universe as imbued with story. It had a beginning when God created it, it has a middle in the trials and tribulations of humanity's struggle against sin, and it has an end when Christ returns, and, as C.S. Lewis puts it, the author walks onto the stage. But beyond this, Dostoevsky sees the world's narrative as tied up with love of one another. He thinks that the end goal of humanity must strive towards an extreme form of universal brotherly love. All of his other goals are intended to point towards this end. It is the absolute cornerstone of his ethical system, and it immediately provides a personal orientation as well. Like his characters Mishkin, Alyosha, or the ridiculous man, Dostoevsky wants us to devote our lives to earthly active love. He ultimately thinks this is not just in service to his vision of Christianity, but outright equivalent to it, and it is how he imbues the world with meaning. In both cases, a narrative is formed that adds a sense of coherence to life, and in some intuitive sense, makes life worth living. This is obviously especially valuable when someone is suffering, since pleasant experiences do not often raise the question of whether they are worth going through. As Alistair McIntyre has argued, and as we've just demonstrated with the example of Dostoevsky, narrative structures also propose ethical systems and help answer questions like, who am I, what is good, and what does it mean for me to be good and virtuous? Narrative arcs are not simply auxiliaries to the more serious studies of existentialism, ethics, and life. They are an integral part of them. This even comes across in what happens when narratives are removed entirely. I've mentioned this on the channel before, but many pictures of nihilism involve structures that defy narrative components. In the book of Ecclesiastes, King Solomon describes the monotony of each day that begins and ends and then begins again with nothing new under the sun. Albert Camus famously draws on the image of Sisyphus rolling a boulder up a hill only for it to fall right back down again. This is a perversion of the narrative arc of overcoming a challenge, one that explicitly defies resolution. Nietzsche thought that the ultimate sign that you had overcome nihilism is if you would be happy living this same life over and over again for all eternity. That is, you would gladly submit to your existence being totally circular. This was his sign that you had truly made your life a work of art, since you are now strong enough to overcome even the most narrative-defying picture of the world. Someone like Dostoevsky viewed nihilism as partly stemming from a crudely materialistic view of reality, where nothing holds significance and there are only incidental events robbed of any value or meaning. Beyond any of this, narrative is even key to how we understand and process our perceptions of the world. It lets us know what information is significant and needs remembering, and what can be discarded. By tying together fact and action, it outlines which paths are meaningful and which to ignore. No person can learn everything, observe everything. So we require structures that draw us to the important information and protect our severely limited processing power from being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of what is out there. Like an author choosing to describe the trees but not each individual leaf, we act as the drafters of our own experience, predicting, revising, and prioritizing partly according to narrative. Hell, if you subscribe to a Bayesian model of perception, this picture might be much more literal than it initially appears. Here, narrative, in the loose sense of the word, is not just the way that we inject meaning into the world, it is the way the world becomes comprehensible to us. This is inextricably tied to meaning-making, since another way of saying something draws our attention to what seems important is to say that it makes us focus on what's meaningful. All of this means that which narratives we pick, and the health of narration as a whole, is perhaps one of the most important philosophical questions of the age. It's also worth noting that the question has bipartisan interest. While Han is a left-wing philosopher, the same importance on narrative is found in the conservative thinker Roger Scruton's work, especially on art, Wagner, and society. However, this is only one function of narrative structures. In addition to providing meaning, they are also a linchpin of how we form and develop our communities. If you want to help me make more videos like this and support the channel, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful patrons on Patreon to get access to occasional exclusive content, including, most recently, my full interview with friend of the channel, Alex O'Connor. 2. Narrative as community. In the UK, there is a very prominent organisation called the Scouts. This is essentially an after-school club for adolescent boys where you learn basic outdoor skills, form social groups, and generally have a pretty decent time. I know that it also has a global presence, but I'm not sure how big it is in, say, America. It's just huge in the UK. When I was in the Scouts, we often went on camps, and invariably part of those camps would involve sitting around a campfire telling one another stories. One of those stories was about a scout from years ago who was known for making a lot of mischief. He was there long before any of us, and yet each camp we would hear tales about him, which were undoubtedly a little embellished from the older scouts. When we were older, we would tell the same stories to the younger scouts, probably with our own unconscious alterations, and so we kept the tale of this nascent trickster hero alive. He became part of the backdrop for our little community, our own tiny Robin Hood, and it drew the group as a whole closer together. It was like having an inside joke, something we were all a part of and could all understand. Except it was better, because not only were we guarding this legend, we were actively constructing it. Each time the tales were told, the storyteller would put their own definitive stamp on it. When we talk about communities today, we often think in terms of abstract values. But as anyone who has ever been part of a community can attest to, communities are just much weirder than this. In Britain, it became very fashionable for a while to try and define what British values are. But the recognisable markers of Britishness are often a selection of odd but distinctive habits that just so happen to pop up a lot in the UK, or at least more than elsewhere, like having strong opinions on how to make a cup of tea, or having been once told what Morris dancing is, but not remembering very much about it at all. You cannot form necessary and sufficient conditions from observations like these, and yet these patchworks of trivialities are part of what allow us to recognise one another as British, and are in some ways more fruitful than what could be cooked up by a philosopher or a politician, because communities are contingent, ever-evolving organisms, not abstractly defined sets. This is certainly not my original observation, and nor is it Han's. It has been pointed out by such wide-ranging thinkers as Michel de Certeau and Pierre Bourdieu. Each region of the UK will also have their own versions of these that are much more detailed. For instance, I am originally from Essex, and I can often spot these strange subtleties in Essex culture just because I lived there for a long time and you just sort of pick it up. One of my friends is from the west part of Russia, and according to him, a key marker of Russianness is that you wouldn't smile at a stranger, as it would come across as overfamiliar. Another one of my friends is from Germany, and he swears that there is a distinctive way that people from his home city check their watches. Obviously, I can't attest to either of these. But my point is that what brings communities together, what makes them seem like us, is a massive contingent accident filled with strange and odd and unexpected things. And one of the most important of these strange, us-creating things is the act of storytelling. Similar to the last section, Han talks about storytelling and narrative in roughly two different ways. There is simply having shared narratives, and there is literally telling stories with other people. The strengths of having shared narratives for a community are pretty intuitive. If we think of narratives as giving us orientation, then having shared narratives is likely to help us move in similar directions. This is both in having shared narrative touchstones like certain myths or legends, but also a similar story for the community itself. If everyone has a rough idea that their community is pointing towards an end goal of mutual support and brotherly love, then that is likely to be quite a cohesive society. If the whole community is pointing towards mutual competition and anti-cooperation, then that will look very different, but in a strange way, it will still be aligned. However, if different people or different groups hold radically different narratives regarding the community itself, then that community will plausibly become more fragmented. For Han, this is partly how extreme polarization occurs. In one of his other books, Infocracy, he even describes this as people living in different worlds, where the very facts of reality are organized in radically different ways, and they may even disagree on the nature of truth. In such a scenario, the mere possibility of social cohesion can begin to dissolve. It doesn't even seem enough to say that they are disagreeing, since they can't even understand one another's worldviews anymore. Even talking to one another becomes borderline impossible. We no longer disagree on just the interpretations of facts, but on facts themselves and how to establish what facts are. For Han, this is what inevitably awaits when narratives diverge beyond mutual recognition. Of course, this is not to say that everyone having a totally shared narrative is necessarily a good thing. If a community narrativizes itself as inherently superior to all others and having an inherent right to dominate them, then that will likely have undesirable consequences, both for that community and anyone outside of it, regardless of how aligned the community itself is on this aim. But even this speaks to the raw power of narrative. It can facilitate terrible things. It could also be used to create successful, cohesive, and internally coherent societies. And, as Han points out, even in extremely destructive shared narratives, a strong sense of in-group solidarity does tend to be fostered. It is just that this is done at the cost of a demonized outgroup. A narrative like Dostoevsky's vision of universal brotherhood, or Theravada Buddhism's idea that we are all fellow sufferers in the same boat, might be able to create a more universal sense of a unifying story. Similarly, Han thinks that narrative is a huge part of what makes political action possible. When the French revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, they were partly spurred on by the narrativized visions of humanity and of France put forward by philosophers, writers, and other thinkers in the preceding decades. So for Han, narrative is not just about forming and stabilizing communities, but also about having the sufficient orientation to change them. Han also praises the very act of telling and sharing narratives. In listening to one another tell a story, we practice the art of sitting still and paying attention to someone else for a prolonged period of time. Ideally, a truly great narrative helps us to forget ourselves temporarily and instead appreciate someone else and what they are doing with this story. For Han, this is direct engagement with another person without getting caught up with what we get out of the interaction. We are all immersed in serving a higher goal, the narration itself. This can seem all a bit abstract, but we've also probably experienced something like this at some point. Again, I'm drawn to my old scout group and how we would work together to keep a particular story alive. We were all participating in a shared project that brought us closer together, and we became more skilled at storytelling itself as a result. To draw from the previous section, we were not just making something meaningful, but crafting it as a group. This is kind of a trivial example, but it goes to show just how impactful shared storytelling can be. Think about when you last met up with some old friends and you just sat around reminiscing about past adventures and tales from days gone by. This is not just fun, it also keeps a part of you from that past alive in some sense. And it allows you all to participate in crafting the legend of that past. We become like ancient chroniclers, jotting down embellished interpretations of past events, viewing them partly through the lens of history and partly through one of myth. So when Han says that narrative is under threat, this is again an indication of the stakes at play. Narratives are not just enjoyable stories that we tell one another, but part of the threads that connect us. For Han, to threaten narration is to drive us all towards isolation, loneliness, and alienation. So why exactly does Han think that narrative is being threatened? And why is he so worried about it? 3. Positivity, productivity, and profit. A key part of Han's general philosophy is that we have become too positive. By this, he doesn't mean that we've become too upbeat, but rather that we do not recognize the importance of limitation, which he calls negativity, along with a number of other things. We want to have everything, consume everything, and be everything. He notes that products are often marketed on their ability to speed life up, and an increase in information is seen as good, regardless of how that information is sorted or interpreted. It's what he calls communication over community. This extremely positive attitude may even be beneficial when it comes to a business, but Han thinks it is a disaster when it's applied to people. The aim of a business in our current economic system is to grow. It wants to make itself larger and to beat out competition. But this often runs counter to what makes individual people or agents fulfilled. We often desire cooperation in communities and connection with others. So an excessive focus on us and our own individual self-expansion can be deeply isolating. For Han, this excessive positivity is part of why he thinks narratives and our ability to craft our own narratives are in danger. As we discussed earlier, Han thinks narratives are just as much about what you don't notice as what you do. They are about assigning significance to particular facts. But if we have an overwhelming deluge of information just hurtling towards us at any given moment, then this prioritization process becomes significantly more difficult. Orienting narratives are prevented from forming, and instead we fall into a kind of paralysis. We can't check all the information for ourselves, so we give up, throwing up our hands and dismissing the world as a confusing, unintelligible mess that no one could possibly make sense of. Han talks about the pace of information, how the relevance of a particular piece of news becomes ever briefer, giving us no time to process or understand what we're looking at. At best, we just accept whatever narrative we are spoon-fed and hope that there was no nefarious intent or incompetence behind it. And at worst, we are left trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. For Han, it takes time to build narratives, and this is unsurprising. Think about how long it takes for a single story to settle into a culture, or even a small group of friends. Think about how long it takes to sit down and seriously try to make sense of your own life. It requires deep, focused reflection and a slower pace of thought. There is a reason that Aristotle thought that wisdom required the ability to contemplate things, and constructing narrative is no different. But contemplation is a slow and gradual process, and relies on us carefully sorting through the information that we receive, ascertaining what its significance is to us and the stories we are telling, and deciding where it fits into our narrative of life and of the world. This is even reflected in the sheer length of important cultural stories. Homer's epic poems are hundreds of pages long, as are the holy texts of almost every religion on the planet. Han argues that the acceleration of information threatens our very ability to sit down and create narratives like this. Moreover, an excess of mere information can quickly trick us into thinking that we are much wiser than we actually are. It's very easy to read a series of articles on a topic and to think that we understand them. But understanding can be had to a greater or lesser extent. This is one reason why I am such a fan of rereading books. I almost always begin rereading something thinking that I just won't discover much new in the book, and I am almost always wrong. I must have read Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground over 10 times now, and yet each time there is something new to discover and new to reflect upon. But this kind of repeated exposure and slow digestion of inputs is far more difficult when there is the constant pressure to keep up with new information. It can seem like a waste of time, even when it definitely isn't. Han thinks that this shallow, surface-level way that we often engage with information slowly erodes our ability to form our narratives. It makes life seem totally bewildering, since nothing sticks around or endures for us to dwell on or reflect upon. Instead, Han thinks we have the worst of both worlds. We are extremely disoriented, yet somehow also convinced that we are more informed. The world appears to us both as entirely unmysterious and yet too complex for anyone to make sense of. It is both bare and incomprehensible. And since this endless production of information is extremely profitable, this process shows no sign of slowing down. If anything, Han expects it to speed up. And the further we undermine narrative, the less we can truly make sense of or understand the world. For Han, we are treating the human mind as if it is a database you just plug facts into, without recognizing the particular and rather esoteric ways that we humans need to organize information to make it compelling and directional, to transform mere propositions into wisdom and orientation. This acceleration also disrupts our ability to share narratives among ourselves and so tie our communities closer together. As Han puts it, narrating presupposes close listening and deep attention. The narrative community is a community of attentive listeners, but we increasingly lack the patience for attentive listening, even the patience for narrative. For Han, the pressure to constantly be up to date, to be consuming endless information and endless facts, causes us to forget the importance of simply listening to someone for an extended period of time. I'll give you an example of what I mean. One of my friends has met an awful lot of politicians, and he says that one distinctive characteristic many of them seem to have is looking over your shoulder to see if there is anyone else they really ought to be talking to instead, because they're far more important. Han thinks we have all become a bit like those politicians. Either we are just waiting for someone to finish so that we can impose our own ego again, or we are biding our time before the next urgent piece of information arrives. This makes the kind of enduring, enveloping focus that characterizes a real connecting interaction with someone much more difficult. It's like when you talk to your friends and they have their phones out on the table, so that if a new stimulus comes flying in, they won't miss it. And when the phone does buzz and they glance down at it while you're talking to them, doesn't that make you feel just a little less connected to them? A little less close. There is no longer the kind of focus required to craft a shared community narrative. And what narratives we do have left do not fill Han with confidence. He identifies the dominant modern narrative to be individual success and achievement to the exclusion of others, and ultimately the detriment of ourselves. He terms this the neoliberal worldview, but it stretches far wider than a mere economic concept and is as much influenced by Han's spiritual beliefs as his political ones. He judges that our current societies reduce the human down to a performing and productive object. We are primed to behave as good workers and strive for high achievement, but not necessarily to become fulfilled people. Above all, we are told that our individual, isolated economic success is the metric through which we are and ought to be judged. With a dominant narrative like this, we are likely to treat ourselves more as cogs than people, and more machine than man. You can really see the input of Han's Catholicism here. He views people as fully rounded souls, whose ultimate orientation ought to be towards God and his divine will. But even apart from any religious dimension, you can see how the dominance of an individualistic, achievement-oriented narrative might blind us to the connection and community we could find with other people. Han's ultimate picture is quite pessimistic. He both thinks that the current economic and cultural forces are undermining our ability to create new narratives, and also that we are left with narratives that encourage us to become increasingly isolated units, striving for material success, but kept lonely and nihilistic by the lack of helpful storytelling in our own lives. In other words, he thinks that there will be a vicious cycle when narratives become more difficult to construct, and also the narrative that we are left with further makes narratives more difficult to construct. But what can actually be done about this? How could we work on taking back creative control over our narratives? And what can we learn about the importance of narrative itself? Han does not explicitly say, and I'm not sure whether he even thinks it is possible to recover from here, but there are certainly some places, I think, we might be able to start. 4. Stories, narrative, and creation. The founders of awareness logic, Joseph Halpern and Riccardo Pocella, worked from a key point of intuition. Awareness is the first step to knowledge, understanding, and action. If you are not aware of something, then for the time being, it is barred from your conscious knowledge, and you thus cannot commit to reasoned action based upon it. This is one reason philosophical reflection on everyday life can be surprisingly helpful. It can draw our attention and awareness to areas that may have previously lain hidden. So the first lesson Han's work contains is just how important narrative is. We often talk about stories as if they are simply entertainment. We judge them on how lucrative they are and think they ought to be left to the novelists and the filmmakers. But if Han is right, even a little bit right, this is far from the truth. Narratives are not separate from us, but are an integral part of how we interact with and process the world. And whether we like it or not, they are influencing our feelings, thoughts, and behaviors at every moment of every day. To leave such powerful forces entirely up to chance seems to be, at best, short-sighted, and at worst, outright self-destructive. But now that we are aware of how important narratives are, we can begin to understand and question them. After all, we're not starting from a blank slate. We will have inherited a whole host of narratives and assumptions from our environments that may or may not be helpful. As we just discussed, the one that Han singles out for special critique is the human as achievement narrative, where the correct story of someone's life is of a lone achiever producing and consuming as much as they can before they shuffle off this mortal coil, and holding very few duties to anyone else and very few connections to others, especially outside of their family unit. On this view, the very idea of depending on another person is demonized, despite the fact that it is something most of us do every day. I don't know about you, but I don't go and collect my own rainwater. Han thinks that anything that threatens this narrative is likely to be condemned. So this is a reasonably good place to start. What alternative ways are there to look at the story of a human being than as a productive agent? We may not have to look very far. One of the most famous stories in history, that of Jesus Christ, is not about production or personal power, but of sacrifice and love. So much so that the embodiment of love becomes 1/3 of the Trinity. Now, I'm not a Christian, and you might not be either, but my point is, this is a radically different kind of story to the one that Han thinks we have inherited today. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they are doing is worlds away from become a totally independent, competitive, and powerful individual. To draw from the late Pope Benedict XVI, the story of Jesus is not about power, but charitable love. You might end up rejecting this narrative as well in favor of something else, but exercises like this are helpful for realizing that there is more than one personal narrative, more than one way of answering the questions, who am I and what should I be doing? To become conscious of the inner workings of narrative on your mind is the first step to having some control over them. As Socrates pointed out, investigating yourself is a key part of any philosophical project. Secondly, the community aspect of narrative can help us appreciate that unquantifiable togetherness that comes from having these shared stories in our societies. We humans have a slight bias towards things we can measure, because those things are more available to us and thus tap into the availability heuristic. Their quantifiability also allows us to see them in quite a lot of detail. But when it's stretched to its extreme, this bias can lead to us ignoring anything that is more difficult to measure. But just because the value of community narratives cannot be directly plotted onto an Excel spreadsheet does not mean that their impact is not there. Something Han critiques about the way that we often analyze our societies today is that we treat people as if they were cold-hearted, individualist economic agents, when we are unavoidably social creatures with incredibly complex emotional landscapes. We have needs that simply cannot be reduced to monetary factors. Han is not the only person to point this out. Perhaps the most popular figure today making the same argument is the advertising executive Rory Sutherland. Building communities as if we are working with Homo economicus simply will not work. We also have to account for our irrational, meaning-seeking and narrative-loving aspects. Participating in shared stories and shared narratives may be a key part of how we rescue ourselves from our increasingly lonely, atomized, and isolated existence. And this recognition of the human need for narrative also extends to ourselves. This is just me spitballing, but I think one reason we have seen such a visible decline in young people feeling their lives are meaningful is because we don't have access to a clear narrative of improvement and progression. People are struggling to achieve the milestones that used to constitute the broad narrative of adult life. Many of us grew up being told that we would finish school, perhaps attend university, find a job, buy a house, have a family, and provide a decent life for our children. But, as many young people can tell you, buying a house is becoming more of a pipe dream for a large proportion of the population, and providing for a family seems like an increasingly daunting prospect. In some ways, we are being fed a narrative of life that is no longer true to the facts on the ground, and I'm not overly hopeful that the probability of achieving it will be restored anytime soon. So the next question is inevitably raised. What narratives are we going to replace this with? And it is worth this being a conscious effort on our part. What does the narrative of being an adult in the modern world look like, and how can we helpfully construct one? What are we, and how should we act in this context? It is no surprise that young people often feel nihilistic when they are essentially stuck at the end of Act 1 in their inherited narrative with no sign of Act 2 beginning. This transforms life from a satisfying story structure into a cycle. And considering what we said earlier about the link between cyclical structures and nihilism, should we really be so shocked at how young people have reacted? Of course, I am a young person and so inherently biased, so do take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But I do think that being stuck in the narrative of a world that just no longer holds is part of the general malaise that many young people seem to feel today. And finally, our personal narratives are some of the key ways that we can wrest control over our lives. Epictetus once noted that we cannot always control what happens to us, but we do have some control over our interpretations of those events. This is sometimes interpreted as a simple command to control your emotions, but incorporating this within our accounts of narrative, we can view it from a slightly different angle. Whereas the world itself is this huge, eldritch beast that will remain out of our power much of the time, our personal narratives, crafted with the people closest to us and with our communities, provide us with a handle of agency in what would otherwise be a bewildering and confusing universe. Because, to reiterate what we said at the start of the video, narrative is not something that we lay on top of reality, it is the very means by which we understand that reality. And the narratives that we create, both within ourselves and with others, are perhaps some of the most vital projects we will ever undertake. However, if we don't recognize the importance of narrative, then we will be forever in the dark. Or, perhaps even worse, at the mercy of the narratives that others have crafted for us. But if you want to explore more on the philosophy of everyday concepts, then click here to watch my video on the incredibly strange narrative that we have inherited around authenticity. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.